So for those of you who are joining us for the first time, or who may not have heard about the full scope of this program, I'm going to talk a little bit about the program, its goals, and how it came together. For those of you who are returning, thank you for joining us again, and also thank you for your patience as I kind of move through this here. We'll drop a link into the chat to the program's webpage so that you can browse and follow along with some of the trainings here. Let me go ahead and add this in for you. Okay, there we go. So the Trauma-Informed and Healing-Centered program for arts partners is bringing together a diverse team of trauma-informed organizations and practitioners, including Chicago Growth Mindset, Illinois Collaboration on Youth, Illinois ACEs Response Collaborative, and the Institute of Therapy Through the Arts, all with the aim of providing arts partners with sector-wide assistance in capacity building and understanding, implementing, and advancing trauma-informed and healing-centered principles into practice. So they've also been designed to help create the space for the sector to really consider how the role of arts and arts education can mitigate the impacts of trauma and help students thrive during this time and beyond. So the program has been conceived in two primary parts. You're in part one right now. Part one is centered around building a trauma-informed and healing-centered knowledge base. So that's through a series of 13 different trainings facilitated by the consortium of organizations that we're working with. Many of the topics speak to the current moment and provide an essential foundation to trauma-informed care. Also, when working with our collaborators on this program, we really wanted to ensure that the needs of both organizations and individual educators and teaching artists would be met. So we divided the subsequent sessions into two learning tracks. One, to meet the specific needs of organizations and ensure the understanding that this work requires the effort of people at every level. And the other to meet the learning needs of teaching artists and arts educators and individuals. However, the sessions, as you may already know, although specific, are also covering universal topics, and that will be beneficial for anyone in this sector and also beyond. So then part two of the program will begin in March, and that will include a series of collective impact sessions across artistic discipline, facilitated by members of the Institute of Therapy Through the Arts. These sessions will be directed at gaining a better understanding of how this work shows up in the arts. And then the program will also culminate in a final toolkit and guidebook that will include a comprehensive assessment mapped to the trainings, a number of resources from each session, and recorded video trainings. So this is all really amazing. But we definitely didn't get here by ourselves. The genesis of this project really started several months ago with the Arts Ed Response Collective. So at the start of the pandemic, Ingenuity convened stakeholders across the arts ed sector, including CPS teachers, administrators, arts partners, students, and funders, to gain a better sense of what the emerging challenges were, and then to proactively determine ways to mitigate those challenges and plan for the future. And what emerged during that process was a clear need to understand the ways that art could be used as a tool for recovery and healing from crisis. There was also a need for authentic learning practices that would truly support professionals in expanding their practice. So moving beyond the kind of one and done or one-off trainings and really thinking about this as more durational and in-depth. So these trainings provided partners with an important foundation to trauma-informed principles and practice. We received a lot of great feedback from partners, and we wanted to build off of that work to create a more robust and dynamic program. And we also wanted a diverse group of facilitators with various approaches, experiences, and perspectives to really meet the needs of our diverse partner communities and the youth that we serve. And then the program really evolved from there. Okay, so before we get started, I just have a few quick things that I'm going to go through, just some norms for these sessions. As you can see here, under equity of voice and learning, we have take space, make space. So as a participant, please be mindful of any privileged identities that you may hold and help create an environment for everyone to contribute. Then we have speak from personal experience. So let's own our statements and views about things and not presume to be able to speak for others. For being in the moment, we have acknowledged the struggle of the times that we're in. And that essentially means that things are unpredictable right now and challenging. And so things may not always go 100% according to plan. So we ask that you have extra patience and flexibility. Under how we show up for ourselves and each other, We have an openness to learning. So an understanding that we're all learners in this space. And we have used the chat box mindfully. When using the chat box, we ask that you try to make your questions and comments as relevant to what's being discussed as possible. And then finally, confidentiality. So take away lessons, but not personal content. We'll sometimes knowledge share and co-share ideas and resources in these sessions, but if anyone shares anything personal, we ask that you don't bring it out of the space. Okay, thank you. Without further ado, I'd like to hand it off to Jocelyn Vega, trauma specialist of the Illinois Collaboration on Youth, to bring us through today's session. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Courtney. And thank you for everyone who is here. Thank you for inviting us and having us in your workspace, in your home, in your community today. I know we're doing a lot of maybe virtual meetings, right? We're doing a lot of these webinars. So thank you for showing up today and being here today, right? So I am your trainer. My name is Jocelyn Vega. Thank you, Courtney, for the introduction. And today's training is really going to focus on culture and trauma. And this can mean a lot of things. And I am not here to say there's only one way of understanding culture and trauma. We're going to understand this from like a big picture perspective. And I'll be moving through the information, but I want to move with you, right? So if there's any questions, anything that I can clarify, anything that you want to share, feel free to chat me, right? You can private message me as well. We're going to have opportunities for breakouts throughout the training. And really, I'm also here to listen, even though I'll be talking a lot, right? So anything that you're willing to share, I will gladly and respectfully follow you in this training experience. So that's a little bit of like who I am, what's my intention today, how I plan to move forward with the training. Because it's important to know who you're working with, right? And I, again, just want to honor you and your time today. Also, we're going to have a break, a 5-minute break kind of halfway through, just to give you a heads up on that as well. So these are just some learning objectives, kind of what are we doing today? What's the goal of today? And there's 4 main things. One, we're going to start off by understanding ourselves in a group setting, right? How do we shift from seeing ourselves as an individual, right? I am one thing, I am one person, to how am I actually multidimensional? How am I more than just one aspect of my identity? Or how someone might see me, I'm so much more than that. So that's where we're going to start off first. The second thing we really want to focus on is learning about trauma. So this section is just going to talk about definitions very briefly, because it's good to have a common language of what are we talking about? How are we seeing trauma? And, you know, we're coming from New Jersey, Tennessee, Hawaii, even Canada, right? We have people, we have Atlanta represented too. We have people from all over. We are all unique. We all have our own backgrounds, our roles, what we do right now, what we did yesterday. So that learning about the impact of trauma is going to help us all kind of show up together and hear each other out. I also want to highlight that in the following section, this is a big chunk of today's time, but it's understanding trauma through a historical transgenerational lens, and also talking about how our systems, right, United States systems, have caused trauma and continue to cause trauma in communities. So by that, we're going to be really talking about trauma, not just as how do we define it, what is it, but really see the experience of trauma of this nation and say, this is compounded trauma. This is not just one thing, and it's overlapping in so many aspects across so many communities from the beginning of our nation till today and moving forward. So what does it mean to be here? And how are we here in our experiences of trauma? And then the last thing we want to do, this is going to be more of a recap. It's going to be kind of more faster, but it's what are the questions that we can ask ourselves in our workplace, when we're working in community, when we're working with young people in our homes, right? So that we can implement some of this understanding of culture and trauma, the impact of power in organizational structure. So that is where we're going, you know, what's moving forward with the training. And again, just to be transparent with what is coming up, some of the information might be very triggering. As your trainer, I'm just going to move forward to the next slide. You are the most important part of this training. You and your well-being is what matters here. right? You and how you're doing. I just want to say that talking about trauma can be traumatizing. Sometimes, we're not in spaces where we talk about things all the time. Or maybe one of the people in the training, right, shares something and you haven't heard it in that way. Because we're going to have share outs throughout the training. So please focus on yourself, prioritize yourself. You are the most important part of this training. So please, when you need to step out, take that break, right? Don't feel like you even have to look at the screen either, right? You can take notes, you can look outside, you can walk around, do what you need to do to be yourself here. And that's all I want to encourage as your trainer. Make sure you engage with your senses, right? So even just taking a breath, drinking water, looking outside. We don't have to focus on this screen, but rather focus on yourself and how this information is moving with you and how you want to move too. Standing up and stretching, we've been sitting a lot these past few months, right? Being indoors, not having a lot of options. So please focus on your body. Your body gives you information constantly, and whatever you need to do for your body, please do it. I am here absolutely to support that. And then the last thing, if you're willing, if you're open, write someone's name down or think about it. Write someone's name down who you can talk to after this training. So as your trainer, I always debrief with someone. It can even just be going on a walk. But who is someone who you can check in with if feelings come up? Thoughts will definitely come up, right? So who is someone you can decompress with? If there's not someone who you know around or can trust, what's something you're going to do for yourself to, again, decompress, walk forward, right? Take care of yourself. If you want to go for a walk, if you want it to be lunchtime, if you want it to be your break. But please take a moment right now to, for real, think about how you're going to debrief after this training. So I'm just going to be quiet for a second and allow people to do that. Before we talk about trauma, before we talk about culture and trauma and historical trauma in the United States, we got to start with ourselves. We got to ask, who am I as a person? Before we talk about community, before we talk about the young people or families we work with, before we talk about history, right? We got to take a step back and be with ourselves right now. And it's just a simple question I'm going to ask you. But whenever we talk about trauma, we can't talk about trauma as that's someone else, right? Trauma's over there, I'm over here. Trauma is an idea that I'm navigating, that I'm trying to understand. That can be helpful, but we gotta take the first step with ourselves before we step forward and connect with someone else, before we listen, right? Before we give that advice or that direction, it gotta come from us. We have to be present with ourselves. So that's why we're starting this training about gaining a cultural understanding of ourselves, because without ourselves, it's going to be difficult to understand, be empathetic, be compassionate of someone else's trauma, of someone else being in front of you, talking to you, if we're not engaged with ourselves, right? And that is just a suggestion, right? This is just a suggestion of why I'm starting the training in this way, but you matter. You are the most important part of the training as well. So that's why we're starting here. I'm just going to play a brief video to kind of give a framework of how do we understand our multiple selves. And that's described through intersectionality. And we're going to watch a very brief, it's like a 3-minute video on that. But we'll have more of this type of engagement moving forward. And I'm playing that video.
What is intersectionality? Intersectionality is a way of understanding social relations by examining intersecting forms of discrimination. This means acknowledging that social systems are complicated and that many forms of oppression, like racism, sexism, and ageism, might be present and active at the same time in a person's life. Everyday approaches to building equality tend to focus on one type of discrimination, for instance, sexism, and then work to address only that specific concern. But while the career of a young, white and able-bodied woman might improve with gender equality protections, an older, black, disabled lesbian may continue to be hampered by racism, ageism, ableism and homophobia in the workplace. Intersectionality is about understanding and addressing all potential roadblocks to an individual or group's well-being. But it's not as simple as just adding up oppressions and addressing each one individually. Racism, sexism, and ableism exist on their own, but when combined, they compound and transform the experience of oppression. Intersectionality acknowledges that unique oppressions exist, but is also dedicated to understanding how they change in combination. The roots of intersectionality lie within the Black feminist movement, with legal scholar Kimberly Crenshaw originating the term. Crenshaw felt that anti-racist and feminist movements were both overlooking the unique challenges faced by Black women. She stated that legislation about race is framed to protect Black men, and legislation about sexism is understood to protect white women. So simply combining racism and sexism together does not therefore protect Black women. Intersectional theory is now applied across a range of social divisions and also to understandings of domination, such as those associated with whiteness, masculinity, and heterosexuality. Intersectionality is not only about multiple identities, and it's not a simple answer to solving problems around equality and diversity. It is, however, an essential framework as we truly engage with issues around privilege and power and work to bring them into the open. Intersectionality means listening to others, examining our own privileges, and asking questions about who may be excluded or adversely affected by our work. As importantly, it means taking measurable action to invite, include, and centre the voices and work of marginalised individuals.
Thank you everyone for watching that with me. And just to give a very brief recap, because we're going to be using this mindset, right, of understanding others' perspectives, questioning ourselves in privilege, right, not only ourselves as individuals, but as a society and historically. But it's really important that we use intersectionality as a way to holistically see one another, to not tell what is a single story about someone, right, the assumptions that we make, and our awareness and our presence in spaces too. And I just want to read something that someone put in the chat, is by Emily. And thank you, Emily, for sharing this. But an aspect of my identity is others have control. I am white and often meet students who have been previously traumatized, talked down to, abandoned mid-program, been yelled at by people who look like me. It's good motivation to be careful with my actions to avoid reinforcing the negative response to other teaching artists who look like me, right? So that could be an example right there of intersectionality, of how are we centering the lived experiences in this space right now? That means having a conversation with myself, an awareness about myself, and the fact that my identity is shared among another community, right? Across other individuals who have interacted with people who've been impacted in a certain or very negative way. So thank you, Emily, for your timing, for sharing that example, because that is something that drives this video home of how do we listen? How do we question? And most importantly, how do we understand and center the individuals with the lived experiences? Because that should always be the center of what we do as a community member, as a teacher, working in community and for community as well. And thank you everyone as well for your engagement. This is really now just a visual of when we talk about trauma and identity, these are just few examples of how trauma and identity are not only, individual experiences, they're compounded. And when these individual experiences and our identities are compounded, right, we're not adding these things up, they take their own shape. They impact people within their own ways, within their own environment. So when we talk about this concept, right, of trauma and identity, it's not an idea. It's how is it uniquely lived and experienced by an individual navigating that, right? What are the resources? What are the people nearby? How do we deny trauma to begin with, right? And that connection to identity. And here we have a quote, is that our experiences of trauma and adversity are shaped by our various aspects of our identity. And with this is kind of our landing ground, right, for today's presentation. And now I'm going to transition to, this was a share out. I should have put this earlier on, but we can continue sharing out and reflecting throughout this training. So please know that in this presentation. Now we're going to kind of have a level setting conversation about trauma and talk about its impact. So this might feel like it's moving a little fast just because I want the later part of our presentation to really drive the examples, really drive the perspectives that we want to have in this training, okay? So if it feels fast, it's because we're moving towards that, okay? So just before we get started, I'm going to just launch a poll. And the second poll here, and I'll launch it now, it says, do culture and cultural practices impact trauma? So there's not a right answer. This is just to understand, right, what are our thoughts? So yes, culture can cause trauma. Maybe no, only individuals can cause harm, or maybe we're unsure, right? And there's no right answer. This is just for us to kind of meet one another because we're coming from all over the nation, right? We're even international right now with, I think Canada's here as well. So this is just us to meet one another, okay? No pressure at all. So people are filling this out. Thank you so much. We're almost at that 100% again. Thank you. And I'm just gonna share the results now. But we're kind of in that first one, right? Of yes, culture can cause harm. So we'll provide more examples, but I just want to say when I'm presenting culture and trauma to you right now, I'm going to be talking about it through what is the culture of power? What is the culture of oppression? How does this shape our society through our systems, right? So maybe it's our economic system. Maybe it's the ways in which we legally deprive people, right? Or make it illegal for someone to be in existence, right? So we'll be moving through that. I also want to give a heads up. We'll be talking about two very fundamental traumas of the United States in our next section. So thank you everyone for being with me and doing this poll as well. Feel free to keep engaging in the chat, ask any questions. I will have my eyes on it. And now I just want to again provide like some definitions. So this is a SAMHSA's definition of trauma. This is something you've maybe seen already, but they define trauma as 3 E's, right? What is a traumatic event? What is a traumatic experience? And what is a traumatic effect, right? And they're talking about this from an individual place, right? So maybe the traumatic event was something that only happened once, one time. But we can also think about it as a series of events. We can think about trauma that's sustained or chronic. We're also going to be talking about intergenerational trauma in this training, just as a heads up. So we'll talk about that later. And I also want to highlight systematic violence, right? So a circumstance that can be systematic violence is poverty. That's a really, really common example here we see in the States, right? Poverty can be traumatic, and it is traumatic, right? And when we talk about these things, we're talking about it through our multiple dimensions of ourselves. So our emotional self, our physical self, our social self. We're also not just individuals in this world, right? We are connected to people. So maybe we've seen trauma in our parents, in our siblings, in our aunts and uncles, right? In our community. Maybe we've seen it generationally of where's the support going to come, right? Where is the healing going to start if we're constantly wounded? So this is also very spiritual, right? And by spiritual, I mean, how is your soul? How is your spirit? How are you doing within yourself, right? That is a huge impact of trauma as well. So again, we're not just one thing. We're not just one person. We are multidimensional. And I just want to say too that with trauma, sometimes we don't even know it's trauma. What happened around us or that we witnessed was trauma. And it's until maybe the experience of trauma where we have language, right? Maybe we're finally safe. We're safe with someone to talk and process what happened or what happened around us, right? And the effects, we're going to talk about that later, but let's think about trauma, yes, from an individual perspective, but let's question the environment, the systems, the culture of power that causes trauma to begin with. So with that, these are just some examples of traumatic events. Just give trigger warnings. A lot of them are violent. A lot of them relate to individual experiences of abuse, but we might experience, or we might work with people who've experienced multiple of these things, right? Who maybe parents or families have as well. And let's be honest, a lot of times communities that are marginalized are victim blamed, for experiencing incarceration, right? Or experiencing domestic violence, or experiencing, let's say, emotional abuse, right? And that is a culture of power. When someone is experiencing harm, you blame them. That is their responsibility. That is their fault. And that's questionable, right? That is questionable because in the next slide that we have coming up, I just want to move forward there. This is the ACEs study. So this is a study that was done to understand with adults, right? People who are not in their teens, right? Or no longer children, but ask them within their childhood, did they experience some adverse events, right? Maybe it was a divorce. Maybe it was a form of abuse. Again, content warning, the examples are, violent, they're traumatic, just giving a heads up. And they ask, adults these questions about their childhood, and a lot of adults experience adverse childhood events, right? And that that was impacting them now as adults, right? So that people say inner child, right? Who you were as a child staying with you, is present with you, right? Might still be confused, might still be seeking support and recognition, right? As us as adults, even though quote unquote we grow up, right? No, we grow within those experiences and they can shape us, like we heard in the video, right? Trauma can be compounded. I also want to highlight that in this specific study, this is the Philadelphia ACEs study, and they took it further. They said, yes, we can look at adverse childhood experiences of an individual, but we need to take a step back. We need to take a step back because individuals exist within a community, within an environment that existed before them, that was here before them. So let's be honest. What existed in the environment that shaped these dynamics? And we can see, right, from this study, the community violence, lack of educational economic opportunity, racism, discrimination, poor or unaffordable housing, poverty, right? And one of those things by themselves is detrimental. But when we look at the historical reality of communities in the United States, all these things have existed. And communities at the same time have been blamed for these environmental dynamics, right? And I just want to highlight that adverse community environments are shaped by institutions, right? We can think about economy. We can think about labor, right? If you're being exploited at your job, don't have rights, don't have the ability to gain wealth or to advocate for yourself, that's an example of lack of educational and economic opportunity, right? But we can blame people for not working hard in school, right? For not saving money. And we have to be honest that these dynamics are deeper than just blaming people. I also want to highlight that in the study, they also said we got to take another step back and highlight the collective historical experiences. We literally have to look at the soil of our nation and ask, this trauma that we're seeing within individuals, within childhood, has a context, didn't come out of nowhere. We have to look at the fundamental traumas of our nation. And these are just some examples that we'll talk more in the training. But we have to ask too, when we see something like domestic violence, right? Or parental separation or incarceration, we got to ask, right? Like in the intersectionality video, what is the existing culture, that allows this type of violence to happen to groups, to people to begin with? We have to ask, when does this violence happen? Why is this violence being allowed? And we're seeing it at a certain scale where we can't deny it. And if we are going to deny it or victim blame, what does that say about us? What does that say about our state? What does that say about our willingness to deny the humanity of someone else? And what does that say when we deny the humanity of someone else about our own humanity as a nation? This is what the Philadelphia study did and how we can use it in this training. So that is just like a heads up of kind of the tone and the flow of the training moving forward. I also jumped ahead and I already asked this poll, and you all answered almost of culture and cultural practices impact trauma. And we're going to go more specific with that moving forward. I also want to highlight here that There's going to be a lot of triggers in this section. We're going to be specifically learning more or engaging with Indigenous communities and their experiences of trauma, specifically with boarding schools and family separations. We're going to hear from a survivor, and he's also an activist. But following that, we're going to talk about intergenerational trauma. We're going to talk about the transmission of trauma. And we're also going to hear from a professor, Dr. DeJoy, about the experience of enslavement as well as a fundamental trauma in this nation. So again, just, giving everyone that space to know like what's coming up. And how I'm presenting this information is really, we're talking about historical trauma. We can talk so much about an individual, but we need to be honest about our history. We need to address things at their roots. And we can't escape the soil, right? If you go back to that image, the soil is a collective adverse experiences. And we need to address the root, or at least be at the root to see how we've grown and how this trauma is continuing. So again, just giving people kind of that warning of there's going to be a lot of intensity coming up. Just again, a self-care reminder, a content warning. And as I mentioned, it's talking about historical trauma, unresolved grief. So again, there's definitions here. They're just available for folks, right? Because you're going to have these slides afterwards. But this is something I'm going to allow the people in the videos to share, to not speak for their experiences. But I also want to highlight disenfranchised grief. So disenfranchised grief is when we deny grief for communities, right? We maybe hear this already, but we say, hey, things are better now. That's in the past. You need to get over it, right? That happened to your people, not you. So I got a question in the chat and I want to answer it. So Angie said, will there be a recording too? Yes, but Courtney or Nicole, let me know. But I think people, when you share out, that's not going to be recorded. So I just want
Yes, that is correct. So the recording for this particular session will be available probably in a couple of weeks on the website for this program. But if any participants today have used video or audio, don't worry, you won't be on the actual recording for the session.
Thank you, Courtney, and for that. And thank you, Angie, for your question. That's super helpful. So, you can always come back to this, of course. But one thing I just want to highlight before we, go to the video of a Native American survivor of boarding schools, an activist, is also anticipatory grief. Communities that have experienced historical trauma in this nation also can experience anticipatory grief of anticipating a trauma that might happen, a harm that will happen to their community due to what's happened in history, due to the lack of trust, that is very real, right? Of how am I going to be hopeful, right? Hopeful of this is going to change. This is going to go a new direction if it's been hundreds of years of this. If my parents, grandparents, great-grandparents can directly speak to how we've been disenfranchised, to the broken promises. So those are two terms I want to share with everyone of disenfranchised grief and anticipatory grief. That is very much words that we can use in this conversation. I'm going to play a video now. So as you can tell, this is going to be about how the United States suppressed Native American identities through boarding schools. Again, the content warning, they're going to mention a lot of forms of physical, emotional, sexual abuse. These are things that happen to children. I want to highlight something in the chat. Thank you, Kimberly. The Black community is discussing now in regards to COVID testing, anticipatory grief. So thank you so much for providing that, because this history isn't in the past. And even culturally, right, as a society, we talk about, the future is not the past at all, right? The future is the future. But how we talk about anticipatory grief or disenfranchised grief is because the past is present and has shaped so much of us. So Kimberly followed up of this, their comment was specifically referencing the Tuskegee experiment, which we'll follow up with a resource for more information for folks. But with that, thank you, Kimberly, and anyone who is sharing, thank you. I see you and appreciate you. But again, those content warnings for this, there's also going to be intense music in the background, just giving you a heads up on that.
They wanted to destroy our identity, and they put us on these boarding schools. I'm one of them that they put in these boarding schools. You know, destroy, kill the Indian, save the man. And over 100,000 children were taken from their homes and pulled, and a lot in our family, and I'm fighting, where am I going, where am I going? You know, my mom and my grandma are right there, and I'm trying to hold on to them, and they come and take us apart. And, but that scene was, multiply that by 100,000 children that were taken by force from their mothers and from their grandmas and grandparents. That destroyed the language. Mm-hmm. Destroy the songs. Mm-hmm. Matter of fact, you couldn't sing any native song. You couldn't speak any native language. The vernacular would be English, and English only. That's how they wrote it up.
In the boarding schools?
Yeah. And there was corporal punishment there. But there was also, I mean, I was in a school where there was priests and nuns. That was the first one, and I heard the screams, and I was part of the screams, and the running away, and the beatings, and the whippings by belts and leather, and raping. I heard those screams. It just, I hear it today. I said I would never forgive this government for allowing a policy like that to be inflicted upon us. And so historical trauma is still with us. And that's when Standing Rock happened, all of this trauma and saying, hey, we're gonna go, we gotta go support them at all costs.
Again, thank you everyone for watching that with me. Again, like this is a very intense section, right? Of this is Dennis Black. Like Dennis Black is still here, right? He's with us. This is not 200 years ago, 400 years ago. This is someone who is living, right? As part of a larger campaign of the nation, right? To create genocide and maintain genocide. And there's survivors who are still fighting, still organizing their communities today. Thank you, Judy, for dropping a link. I just want to highlight Judy for sharing that. And that takes us to our next slide, right? Of Dennis, sorry for that. Dennis Black highlighting what are some traumatic response features, right? So, you know, there might be some survey. So these are trauma responses, just to take a step back of when we experience trauma, there's certain reactions, behaviors, effects, right? Going back to those 3 E's that we experience. But when we take a step back and talk about historical trauma, this is an entire list based on Dr. Braveheart's early childhood development research on what are the historical features that you can experience to trauma. So some examples, right, is survivor guilt of I survived, but others didn't, right? And these might be dynamics we hear when we're working with youth, right? We're working with survivors of domestic violence whose families have experienced domestic violence or continue to experience is one example, or maybe substance abuse is another example, right? Of that guilt of how am I alive when so many of us haven't, right? That kind of pressure and weight. There's so many here that we can talk about, right? The loyalty to ancestral suffering and the deceased, right? Knowing your people weren't put to rest or had their lives taken from them, right? Ancestors who are known and unknown is just one example. And there's so many here. And one thing I want to highlight too is that when we talk about historical trauma, I really want to bring this to the table of, we don't always talk about the generations that were causing harm, right? Or benefiting from the harm and violence. And there's not a section here in the training, but as a society, we got to be honest about that, right? This boarding school dynamic, right, was part of a greater history of genocide against Native American communities who are still here and very much still fighting and thriving. But let's talk, right, about where does all that hate and violence and values go when that has existed for hundreds of years as well. And I just want to offer that on the table because we don't have that here, but I think that's important too, to talk about intergenerational hate, intergenerational violence, because this was committed and done by people, right? Policies were organized and put in place to separate families, to allow these dynamics to children. And this was part of other policies and dynamics that happened for hundreds of years as well, right? So I just want to bring that to the table, again, using intersectionality of what are all the ways that we can look at this at the same time. Thank you, Gail. I'm just reading the chat. And the fact that through the 1960s, Native peoples were sterilized involuntarily, right? And unbeknownst to known them. So it was just, it was done to them without their consent, right? Without permission, sterilizing an entire community. They would make up some excuse for the surgery and then sterilize them instead. So thank you, Gail, for bringing that dynamic as well, right? Of the genocide was so present, right? 1960s was not long, y'all. That was not long ago. And we're talking about dynamics that existed for hundreds of years, right? These are just recent examples. So now when we talk about trauma, to bring back what is the impact of trauma, we're going to talk about this through some impacts, right? One, on the family level, right? How can a family function if a family is being separated? How can a community heal if it's constantly being wounded and targeted and backed by legal, political, and economic institutions? That parental stress, right, is going to be very intense if your humanity is being denied and you're responsible for another human who can be taken from you, right? How can anyone be present? Okay, all right. And I don't want to cross out intergenerational wisdom, the strength, the just resistance that communities have had, but we can't use resilience as an opportunity to say, you're so strong, right? You can keep moving forward. There is wounding that has happened and that impacts families, communities, cultures. And then on a community level, right? Genocide is systematically erasing culture. That is the goal. That was driven from the Dennis Black talking about, you couldn't even speak your language. You were beaten, right? If you sang your song, right? Or any cultural practice. Thank you, Judy, for sharing this. So I'm just going to read this quickly. There's also the guilt over not knowing or not knowing enough about our language and culture. So thank you for that, Judy. Anger about institutional practices and impact that cause harm to our families. And now 3 generations later, they often ask why our children are struggling in the educational system. So thank you so much, Judy, for that. I'm just going to kind of let that sit as we transition to the next slide, right? Of how pervasive this impact is. It's not an event that happened and it's done and it's in the past, it's present with us intergenerationally. And just thank you, Judy, for your comment, because that really brings us here into the transgenerational transmission of trauma. So this is a visual, but I think Judy's comment, and thank you, Judy, really drives this example of something that happened and is occurring 3 generations ago, right? Is still present with you now. So I hope you can see my mouse. If not, this is not going to really work. But if you're a child, right, Dennis Black experiencing child abuse in the boarding schools, that is something that was caused by a system, right? What are the ways in which you navigate that as a young person who is living in a society that's causing harm, is removed from their community, right? But this society, right, or maybe that school, that boarding school wants you to perform to a very specific standard, right? If you don't speak English, you get in trouble, right? But we overlook what is the child abuse that Dennis experienced. Then we can move forward, right? Of what are some traumatic experiences you have in the society experiencing trauma? Judy mentioned, right? Failing school. How are you going to succeed in a school system that is oppressing you? It's going to be, I'm not sure how, and I don't have an answer for people, right? And that can lead to school dropout or other coping mechanisms because you're in a society or in an environment that isn't recognizing your humanity, isn't connecting you to resources, isn't reaffirming the trauma that you have if it's causing and denying the trauma to begin with, right? So then we talk about the next generation, right? And how that can be transmitted to the following as well. I'm pausing right now because I think it's really important to take a step back and say, we have to acknowledge intergenerational wisdom, intergenerational brilliance from ancestors who fought, who organized, who did everything that they could, despite having all these odds, institutional odds, organized against them. So if I could have like another slide here to show you based on research, the intergenerational and ancestral brilliance and wisdom that our communities have pushed forward for us to even be alive today, for us to recognize ourselves and be with one another. I just want to highlight that as well as transgenerational trauma, because we don't always talk about that. We don't always talk about the solidarity that comes within these moments and the collective care that our communities did because we survived together, right? Despite so much against us. So with that, I'm just going to move forward to the next slide of highlighting again that ACEs study, right? How things that happen to our childhood can impact us into adulthood. But this takes another step back and ask, right? The ACEs study be like, hey, have you incorporated historical trauma? So we have the slide here, and then we have another slide here. I know you can't see me, so it's not the same, but I'm like motioning to the other slide. And here at the bottom, they said, hey, we need to add trauma and social location in the ACEs study, right? So let's talk about structural racism. Let's include white supremacy. Let's talk about how the society devalues consistently people of color, as well as intergenerational transmission of trauma, which we just covered. And thank you, Judy, for sharing, because that is one of the strongest examples anyone can share, as well as historical trauma and how that impacts the quality of life or how you lose quality throughout your life, right? Trauma is not just what happens and how it ends. We're talking about a trauma that's been present for hundreds of years in the founding of this nation and its continuation, right? We're talking about burden for people of color and communities. Coping. How can you cope in a society that's traumatizing you? It's not going to always bring you the resources that you need and that you deserve, right? We're talking about harm. And we're also talking about healing and how that's very difficult to navigate. And then in the next slide here, I just want to, again, take that step back and allow other voices in the room. But we're going to now watch a video about historical trauma and African Americans. And this is a lecture that I'll send you afterwards. It'll be a full lecture. This is just a snippet, but again, giving a content warning on family separations. Enslavement is traumatic, and we don't always talk about it like that. So again, those content warnings of enslavement, family separations, mental health concerns and needs. So again, just giving people that time, to check in with yourself and what you need before it starts. But she also highlights intergenerational wisdom, intergenerational and ancestral practices. So I just want to give her a shout out for that too. So with that, I'm just going to play.
We're unique as individuals. Everybody's not traumatized by a traumatic event, whether it's direct or not. But when we start talking about chattel slavery, we're not talking about one trauma. We're not talking about a specific event. We're talking about generations of trauma with no intervention. Based on what I know about sugar plantations, tobacco, and the Caribbean, what I know about American chattel slavery and the plantations there, does anyone right now ever recall mental health assistance to slaves? Anybody remember sending in the therapist after I sold off your son, daughter, raped folks? At any point. Never. Second question. After slavery was officially over, now you're free. Anybody remember any therapy then? We know it's been rough, it's been deep for you, it's been difficult. We're going to do a little group therapy. Anybody remember that? That would be no. Number 3, after slavery officially ended, both in the States, in the Caribbean, the British ended, do you remember whether or not trauma continued? Did the trauma continue for people of African descent? I need to know. Okay, so now let's do the math. Hundreds of years of trauma, no treatment. Freed, more trauma, no treatment. What do you do the math? Do you think there may be residual impacts of that trauma? Of course there is. It didn't end, friends, and it hasn't ended yet. So I think on one point, African people and people of African descent are extremely resilient. Matter of fact, I think we're a miracle. Far be it for us to pathologize or to look and cast this idea of weak and sick people. Oh, on the contrary, I'm profoundly resilient because we've done everything we've done thus far with no help, with not even the ability to have this discussion. As though it were possible, we escaped injury in all those hundreds of years and the years that follow.
Thank you everyone for watching that with me. I'll be sending the full video, so if people want to watch it, they can. But really, Dr. Joy DeJoy, she really drives it home, right? Of where have been the interventions, where have been the conversations, and the fact that this was a lie told 400, 500 years ago at this point. And where is the truth even being spoken right now? So with that, I'm just going to move to the next slide. And really, this is now from Dr. Yellow Braveheart. I'll be sending a follow-up item of her, but she talks about how do we heal from historical trauma. Just to give her a context of who she is, she's a Native American mental health expert. And this is what she presents of how do we confront trauma and embracing history. So this isn't just who experienced the trauma, right? Who was part of what part of history? This is really, no, as a nation, as a collective, everyone involved, not just who's alive right now, but everyone from these past hundreds of years. How do we confront? Then how do we understand, as well as release? And then the next thing she says here is, how do you transcend that? So this is what she presents from her work, and we want to honor how this is ongoing. And again, share that in this presentation. In the next slide here, we want to talk about, how important, going back to the beginning, our individual identities are, right? The connections we have to who we are and what shaped that. So one thing that comes from the principle of La Cultura Cura, the culture cures, is that knowing who you are and where you come from serves as a source of healing from intergenerational and even personal trauma. One thing they also offer within this framework, right, is exploring our ancestral roots, biological and claim, allows us to dig deeper and learn traditions and teachings that increase our sense of belonging. So one quote, just giving everyone like a, background of who I am. So I'm Mexican, and one thing that I was told growing up is that they tried to bury us, but they didn't realize we were the seeds, right? And that kind of goes into this of the culture cures, right? Because if you're a seed, how do you remain planted? How do you nourish yourself? How do you realize others are growing with you as well? So just bringing a little bit of like me into the presentation and giving background to La Cultura Cura, that's just a quote I offer everyone, right? We are our ancestor seeds. We are what continues to grow and is nourished by them, right? Planting us there, taking care of us. So again, as we talk about intergenerational trauma, I'm always going to say, let's talk about intergenerational wisdom, brilliance, resilience, for us being here. And how we got here was because of them, not the individuals causing trauma in our lives. This is just guiding questions. You don't have to stick to these. This is just what, again, I'm putting on the table, but you're at the table and you decide what you want to do when you're there. You can talk about how does historical trauma, historical trauma impact you or the individuals you work with? And how can we support individuals in healing from historical trauma and its ongoing impact? Again, this is just on the table, but meet each other at the table and listen to where the conversation goes. This is just an offer. So again, thank you, Courtney, for dropping that in. And we're going to get that going. And again, one of the greatest acts we can do as humans is listen to one another, respect one another as well in that space. And we're going to have another breakout too. So when we come back, if you're willing to share, this is definitely the space, and we'll honor you too when we all come back. And with that, you'll be invited to a breakout room soon. You'll have like 10 minutes to be there. And thank you everyone for joining too. Coming back to, it's great seeing people. So now to wrap up, it's just some final questions. You're gonna have these slides with you, so don't worry about writing everything down. You're gonna have this in your lovely email box. And these are just some questions. So we've talked a lot about history, right? We talk a lot about what's present, right? And these are just some questions that I'm sharing with you because this is where I was coming from in this training. You're kind of like in my brain right now of what are the questions? What other dynamics that I brought in are these questions? So it's reflecting on maybe when we had power. What gave you power? How did it feel? What did you do with that power, right? It's also reflecting on a moment when you did not have power, right? Why didn't you feel like you have it? This can also be an activity you do in your teams, a reflection you have within, if you work with young people. These are just questions, right? A map. And then when you felt like you didn't have power, how did you manage it, right? Were you supported? Were you seen? Were you denied? Victim blamed, right? And this is just to say, right, when we think about power and identity, it's not just one thing, it's many things. So again, just leaving you with some reflection tools. If you work with youth, if you work with groups, if you work in teams, this is just some ways we can move forward, okay? We're also going to be providing reflection questions from Brittany Packing Cunningham, who organized this whole resource that we'll share with you. And she asked a lot of questions about power and identity. So I'm just going to read a few. But she asked, right, if we're going to talk about power and identity, how are we talking about personal power? And not just you yourself, right? What is your personal power? But what is the personal power within the room? So this can be our workplace. This can be within our community settings, our households, right? So one of the questions I highlighted here that just stands out to me, but all these questions are great, is when we talk about personal power, are people using their personal power for credit or for change? And for me, when I work in community spaces or people who want to work with my community, that's always a question that comes to mind for me. Is this for credit or is this for change? And these other questions too, right? Who's going to be accountable? What do you want to be true in this world for yourself or your community, right? These are, again, just reflection questions I'm leaving you with as we finish. Also, these are other questions. So when do we question power? And how do we question it, right? Do we question who's hoarding power or who's not sharing power, right? Are we thinking in what ways, right? Are we pursuing equality or equity? Because those are very different things. A question I highlighted here is, does your framework create tokenism or respect intersectionality, right? So again, going back to that video in the beginning, how do we see and allow and respect that people are multiple dimension, right? That we can just add up oppressions and say by adding what we understand of each one, we got a solution for all of them, right? No, they're compounded and shifted in a very specific way based on the experience. And are we honoring and centering people with lived experiences in what we do? And if we don't, we risk creating tokenism. So again, more questions. She also has another section of how do we redefine power? How do we redefine power? I just want to repeat that. And one question that stands out for me is that what deserves more investment? So this conversation can be, yes, in your workplace, how you work with youth, but also we can think about this in our cities, in our states, right? Our local towns. We can even think about this in like a literal way, right? City budgets, national budgets, right? In the United States, there's conversations right now about stimulus package, right? Where is the investment going and what deserves more investment? These are very concrete ways that we can redefine power. And other questions that she has is, you know, what is the power of imagination when we talk about power and identity? So one of them is, you know, asking ourselves, how is your privilege affecting what you imagine to be possible? And you can look back just to the summer in the States of the clashes and the tensions of telling people that's impossible, that's unlikely, that's never going to happen. When we talk about social movements, when we talk about uprising, right? So that is just one US example that I can share with everyone. But how does our privilege shape or change what we imagine to even be possible, right? And then the power of storytelling, asking ourselves constantly, what are the stories are we telling as an organization where we work? What are we telling the community? What are we offering and how do we show up to it, right? Another thing I highlighted here is how can you tell your story, right? Or if there's another way we can tell the story is another thing. So yes, we can talk about intergenerational trauma, but equally important, how are we talking about intergenerational wisdom, ancestral strength and growth, right? What is the story and how are we making sure we're not just telling one story? Because our ancestors, our communities, our history is not just one thing either. And it's not that simple. So we deserve more complexity because we are that. So again, there's positional power too. This is something she adds of how do we plan backwards when we talk about what is change? Who has the power to make it? How can we push them? How can we employ and collaborate to push power? So now we're at the end of the presentation. I will, be around for Q&A, but this is just some final slides. And this is now power and oppression, right? So we're talking about power and identity throughout this whole training. Now to leave you with some takeaways for power and oppression, another thing we've talked about throughout the training. But this is something we've talked through the training, right? We've talked about levels of oppression. And we've talked about it not only through trauma, but how trauma shows up as a society, culturally, institutionally, right? So Devon mentioned our educational system. The way in which we're taught and learn is traumatizing, right? And then the economic perspective of education of our communities are disinvested and have been. And yet we're blamed for not performing well, right? How does that work out? It sounds like victim blaming to me. As well as we want to highlight with levels of oppression, interpersonal actions, right? So the ways in which we engage with one another can be oppressive as well. Personal and individual levels of oppression, right? So I would just highlight racism is an individual interaction, yes, but that also exists within institutions, within society, within culture, that it reinforces that individual to feel entitled to be racist towards someone, or how individuals feel entitled to punish an individual based on race or deny someone based on race, because there's a historical reality that exists and that's in place. Then there's also microaggressions, right? And this is something that we need to talk more about, but unfortunately this training is coming to an end. But what are the everyday verbal, nonverbal, environmental snubs that occur and take place, right? Many cases they're hidden. I would say, just again, being personal, I've experienced the most microaggressions in the workplace, and just feeling like, who do I talk to? Where do I go, right? And if that person is, let's say, like in charge, right, or a big boss or whatever, I'm in a position where I'm like, what do I do? Who do I go for? Am I being gaslit right now and being told that's not a big deal, right? So that's just like an example I'll use here of saying that microaggressions are a continuation, right, of the historical trauma we're talking about now that allows people to interact in these individual ways against others, right? Because you're targeting people through this. So again, these are just some examples. We've talked about this in the training, right? I just want to highlight some other forms right here. We can include citizenship, right? Marginalization based on citizenship, class, so working class, right? Not having money saved, so if you're not wealthy, right? Another example is your staff role. Depending what position you have in an organization, that can really shape marginalization as well. Your partner status or your family status, right? Another thing that can come up is mental health. So you being marginalized for your mental health needs is another example. Also language and accent. So the ways in which you hear someone say something in a certain way, and it's like hey, this person's not, from my area, they're speaking different than me. Let me point them out, right? So those are just so many ways that marginalization can take form. I also want to highlight COVID-19 as one of the largest marginalizations that has taken place collectively in the past year and continues. Just pausing on that. And there's more, right? These are just some examples. And again, going back to the video we watched in the beginning, it's not about adding these things up and saying, okay, by understanding each one, we understand how to solve this, right? I understand what this is, because what you've lived and what I've lived and what we've each lived is so personal and unique that we're not adding. We're not trying to understand something. No, we're so much more complex than that. And marginalization takes its own life in people's experiences, right? So just again, offering this as something on the table and how we can engage with it. So again, we've been talking about this throughout the training, but resiliency is something I always try to push for, because our ancestors, our communities have been extremely resilient against the amount of historical oppression, how it's been organized in institutions. But I just want to pause and say that resilience is not the same as healing. I just want to pause on that, because it's not. They're very different. They can work together, of course, and they can both be present. But resiliency really focuses on the process of adapting, right? And face of adversity, of trauma, of tragedy for generations. So yes, we have wisdom of resiliency, but also I just want to kind of take a step back and give more of a personal opinion of, why do communities need to be so resilient to begin with? Why does the next generation and generations have to be so resilient? It's exhausting. Being resilient is also exhausting. And as a community and as a nation, right, how much are we honoring the amount of resiliency that has taken place from nothing, right? Resiliency comes from the face of trauma. Trauma doesn't give you that much to hold on to, right? So as a community, as a nation, how are we being mindful of not telling communities or young people that, wow, you're so resilient, you can keep going for it, right? You got this, you've overcome this, you can overcome anything. Or even just as a society, right, culturally, we say, well, what doesn't kill you makes you stronger. That's concerning to me, right? That's super concerning to me, because there's a lot that can happen in between those two. And we should stop putting communities and individuals in these extremes to begin with. We should stop with our institutions and our practices that put people in the face of trauma, that put individuals, communities in tragedies and threats. Because at this point, it's not if it's happening, it's been historical. So again, just giving people that like other way of thinking about resiliency, because we're wrapping up, we're at the end. And then what supports resiliency, right? What supports resiliency is not you as an individual, right? You do the work, you carry the weight of resiliency. Resiliency is possible when we're surrounded through supportive relationships, right? When we were doing the second breakout, they said, right, giving young people safety, the tools, the ability to channel their trauma, their experiences, and grow it in their own ways. That is not an individual responsibility. That is a reflection of a community that is supporting and honoring this person's trauma. So again, just offering that breakdown of resiliency, we say, wow, you're so resilient, you're so resilient. But why don't we say, hey, your community is supporting your resiliency, right? You are connected to people in spaces that are resilient towards you, that are supporting your growth, right? This is not an individual project. So yes, there are individual aspects like your self-esteem, your social skills, right? Your understanding, but we want to scale it up, right? So family is also chosen family, right? It's people in our lives, it's strong values. We also want to highlight community and society, right? So a lot to say, a lot to break down. And these are just some examples of organizational change. I'm not going to go too into these because we're more of like a general conversation right now. But when we talk about your organizations, where you work, where you're connected to, please look back at these questions of talking about culture and trauma in the workplace, because there's trauma in the workplace too, everyone. That's a whole nother training. I'll see you at that one, but giving you just an example of how we can bring these conversations to our workplace.